Welcome to the Time-Crunched Cyclist Podcast. I'm your host, Coach Adam Pulford. As promised in the last message that we trickled out to you, we've rebranded the TrainRight Podcast to the Time-Crunched Cyclist Podcast based on feedback from our listeners. We think that the shorter format, topics, and content will hit the needs of our listeners even better than before. But of course, we'd like to hear if we're indeed doing that. So go ahead and rate, review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, share it with your friends, or drop us an email at athleteservices@trainright.com. And that's really to help us help you. Now, business aside, today we are going to tackle a timely subject, base training. You've probably been enamored with all the other podcasts that you're listening to, as well as articles that you're reading. It's January, it's the new year, it's base training time, right? Well, we'll take a few different angles on it today and give you some kind of like new content and make it pretty applicable. So in particular, we're actually going to answer the question, should a time-crunched athlete do base training? The short answer is yes. Yes, they should, and yes, you should. The long answer, do you really want to get into it? Well, of course you do. That's why you're here. But first, let's quickly talk about who and what a time-crunched cyclist or a time-crunched athlete is. Time-crunched athletes, we're talking about cyclists and endurance athletes that are typically training 6 to 8 hours a week on average, sometimes more, sometimes less. But you know, they're not time rich. They don't have the 15 hours of training on average. Okay, they may do a long ride once in a while, but in general, we're really looking on the best return on our time to get the biggest bang for the buck in training possible. Okay, and you also don't have the luxury of recovery time. Okay, a time crunched athlete is typically rushing from thing to thing, from training session to work, and they have obligations with family, deadlines, life, all kind of like cropping up to just kind of making their 60 to 90 minute sessions the meat and potatoes of what they're doing. Okay, so does that sound familiar? Yeah, me too. So let's learn how we can do our base training, how we can do our training and do our performance training even better. Let's get right into it. Now, even a time-crunched athlete, like I said, we should do base training, okay? But why? Why should we do base if we're so limited on time? And how do we incorporate it? Okay, so we're going to talk about the why. We're going to talk about the how. First, let's go to the why. It all starts with why, in my opinion. Aerobic training in base training benefits any endurance athlete. Okay, so let's first recall what base training is. Typically, we refer to it as aerobic training, but in particular, zone 2 training. I mean, zone 2 is very synonymous in methodology or as a term out there in just endurance training. And that's based on like a 5-zone model, 5 to 7 zone model, depending on what you're working with there. And when we refer to zone 2, we're really talking about 60 to 75% of functional threshold power, or 60 to 80% of lactate threshold power in some methods, or 68 to 83% of threshold heart rate. Okay. Now, if you're like cross-eyed thinking about those percentages, haven't really looked at that, let's talk about rate of perceived effort. Most methods will talk about a rate of perceived effort, 1 being almost nothing, okay? So just the easiest effort possible, and then 10 being maximum effort possible. So as hard as you can go for whatever duration, that's a 10 out of 10. For zone 2, typically people are referring to, or we coaches, we in the endurance community refer to it as effort of 3 to 4, 3 to 5. Personally, I say 3 to 5, and I think that's really important because, and again, this is my personal view, that zone 2 or endurance range is a very broad range, okay? the number 1 up to number 10 for rate of perceived effort is not linear. So when we go beyond zone 2 into zone 3, zone 4, zone 5, it's actually an exponential rate of fatigue that occurs, and it should be more specific to the number as we increase in the zone and as we increase in intensity. So coming back to zone 2, we kind of have a little, we have variance. We have a broad range, and even like a very medium 5 is very appropriate. So rate of perceived effort, 3 to 5. Keep it really simple like that. If you're using power, again, I gave that percentages of your FTP. Same thing with lactate threshold if you go into a lab, and then you got your heart rate as well. But overall, we're talking about efforts where you can talk while you're doing this training, get a little sweaty if you're inside. But overall, you're not, your ventilatory aspects is not wild and crazy, right? You're not breathing all over the place. You should be able to talk if you're riding next to somebody. So zone 2 helps with, the time-rich athlete because they can do a bunch of it. But for the time-crunched athlete, it still is the general aerobic pathway that helps to build fitness and build very important mechanisms in the body. Okay. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. It also helps to build good habits and fitness. So not every session should be hard, even if you are time crunched. Okay. We wrote the book on Time-Crunched Cyclists. Okay. Where we promote here at CTS, we do promote HIIT training, high intensity aspects of training once we're working at, going somewhere and developing performance. Okay. That's very well known. Read the book. However, even when you're doing a high intensity training period, not every session is going to be hard. And that's where some of this zone 2 can apply to offset some of that harder, intense training. Okay. But as it applies to our base period, it's also important to do from just a building aerobic capacity so that you can handle more load down the road. Okay. Now, from a habit building standpoint, it can also get you in, like if you're out of good training habits from holidays and the kind of the turn of the year, maybe you're riding 4 or 5 days per week, and now it's only 3 or 2 or something like this. Zone 2 doesn't require a ton of mental fortitude and doesn't require a ton of physical effort. Again, we talked about the intensity of it. All you need to do is get on that bike and pedal. So oftentimes when somebody's a little bit out of habit, let's go zone 2. Every day, let's go 4 or 5 days in a row, take a day or 2 off, and then back at it. And so I use zone 2 for time-crunched athletes, 45, 60-minute rides just to build good habits again so that we can then build fitness up. Okay? And when it pertains to fitness, I've talked all about how we CTS coaches, how myself monitors that, and that's in CTL. The third point pertains to some of the CTL because you can build long-term aerobic base that is very separate from a chronic training load or CTL. Okay. If you want to go back into some of the TrainRight Podcast episodes and you'll get more about what CTL is, but it's a marker of fitness based on current physiology or current time periods in an athlete's journey. And it is one of the best markers of fitness, but it's not perfect and it doesn't tell the story of the long term. Okay. At some point, all of us time crunched or time rich athletes will plateau in our CTL because there's just so much training that you can do up to a point where you need to sleep, you need to recover. So based on the time that you have, and say if you're starting from ground zero, you can simply ride zone 2 up to where your CTL will plateau, and then you can start to add in intensity and build up from there. And that's a very simple way to do it. Okay. Well, I'll talk about some examples of that here in just a second. But once you do plateau, it's not and if you keep on riding even zone 2, it's not that the gains stop there. They'll probably slow a little bit, but there's a longer arc of endurance development that occurs year after year after year And you can still get that done through consistency of training. Okay. I'll talk about how to incorporate some of the long ride stuff because that will really accelerate and boost some of the aerobic benefit that we're talking about here. And still, don't hear me wrong. Like, I'm not saying that 1 hour rides will make you an Olympic champion. It's not. Okay. But what I'm saying is don't get caught up in all the data and all the language out there of like trying to gamify some of these metrics, because if you are consistent day to day, week to week, year to year, build, there's some very good physiological chronic adaptations that does happen in the body to build fitness. And meanwhile, when you're burning calories and sweating, you're a very healthy individual. So don't overlook or don't get paralyzed by some of these metrics that may not be moving if you are doing lower volume zone 2 training. There's still a lot of benefit that's going on there. Okay. So those are the reasons why a time crunched athlete should be doing base training. Now let's look at how we do this. Okay. As I mentioned, if you're starting on low fitness, or if you're out of habit from training in the previous year, just simply start by riding more frequently or increasing sessions at zone 2 endurance. If you add more sessions in, you'll increase your training stress per week, and you'll add more volume simply by adding that session. Okay. As I said, do this until you may see that CTL plateau. That could plateau around, 35 or 40, 45, something like this. And then you're ready to add in more intensity. That more intensity could be zone 3. And that's my second point here. If you start at moderate fitness, okay, let's say that, you did a little bit of detraining that I talked about in a previous episode over the holidays, and you're fresh, you're ready to go, but your CTL didn't dip too much, or it dipped some, but it's not like drastically low, and you're still pretty fit. You kept on riding. You can incorporate some zone 3 training in. Zone 3's tempo or perceived effort of 6, maybe 7 out of 10. It's still a little bit of a broad range there, but it's sub-threshold. And you can add that in by doing it 2 times per week. Here's an example. Tuesdays and Thursdays start with a 3x8 minute tempo, 3x8 or 10 minute tempo at zone 3 with 3 to 4 minute recovery between. Okay. Let's just say you start with 3x8 on Tuesday, 3x8 on Thursday, and then you slot in a zone 2 endurance ride on Wednesday. Monday, Friday are your off days. Saturday is a good, whatever long ride that you can do, whether it's 60, 90 minutes, 2 hours, something like that. Have that be like your longest ride of the week. And then Sunday can just be another 60, 90 minute zone 2 ride. Over the next 3 to 4 weeks, build up to about 40 minutes of total time in zone per session at tempo zone 3, or as much as you can tolerate in your session. Okay. I'll say that kind of again. You want to build up to as much tempo per session as you can during this tempo build phase. And that's really valuable to do. You want to do it over that 3 to 4 week time period. And again, just put it in on Tuesday and Thursday. Give yourself that zone 2 on Wednesday, and that will help you recover or kind of shake off, reduce the training stress built up on Tuesday before that Thursday session. And I do think that even for a moderate fit athlete, if you're doing this twice a week with zone 2 on the other days, or even recovery miles, which is zone 1, you'll find a lot of success because it's moving the needle forward with higher intensity from that zone 3, but it's still sub-threshold. It's not causing so much fatigue that you won't be able to do that. And in my opinion, in my experience, based on physiological literature, this zone 3 and what we call more like a pyramidal modality approach in training, by going up to this kind of zone 3, this will help in the progression of aerobic development, even within this base period, without ruining anything. Okay. You're not ruining stuff by going over zone 2 in base, even though there's a lot of literature and a lot of individuals out there that will make you think that. Please don't think that. It's not that straightforward. It's not that simple. Okay. And that should comfort you as well, because if all you do is ride zone 2 for 6 to 8 hours a week, and that's all you do like forever, like as I said before, you're going to plateau, you'll stagnate. You're still burning calories, you're still being a healthy individual, but you're not going to move the performance needle forward. So that's why I'm encouraging you within this kind of this base period to add in intensity on zone 3 to help that go forward. Now, I'll come at it in a different angle here as well, with something else that you can add in during a base period. And it kind of goes in line with intensity, but it's on the other end of the scale. You can add in short, hard, anaerobic intervals if this is a weakness or a limiter of yours relative to your goal event. So, for example, let's say you got into the Unbound and you're doing the 100-mile gravel event, and you're in your base period, you're time crunched, maybe, but then you can kind of squeak out some long rides because you know you got to ride 100 miles come June. Well, if the start of these gravel races just like bury you because you're trying to get on wheels and you have these like really hard surges, and that always hurts you, but then you're the person that keeps on passing all the other people like at mile 50 and beyond. One thing that I would encourage you to do in your base period is work on developing some anaerobic capacity. The reason for it is if you're that type of person, and that description that I just described resonates with you, if you do some of this really hard training early on, it's going to help you down the road. It's going to help you in other events as you go throughout the season, but it's not going to hurt you too much during your base period. Okay. Now this is a little different, kind of a little different approach. And if you listen to the Coopcast, where he talks about periodization for his ultra running athletes, it's very in line with more of the ultra community, where doing strength training, doing some really short, hard anaerobic stuff early on is a good time period because volume is low. We're building, there's not a ton of fatigue, and we can get a lot of gain without a lot of risk relative to events and all this kind of stuff. For the more ultra endurance cyclist or athlete, once we start doing a lot more volume training, which is more specific to that sort of event, you won't be able to do this anaerobic training at all, really, because of the fatigue cost associated with it. That's why I've started to incorporate intensity like this into the base period to get us strong and kind of build that before we need it. It's not to say that the sprint is going to help you win the Unbound. Okay, it might if you're like Yuri Hoswell back in 2015, but the sprint is not important for the performance. It's important for the durability that needs to occur throughout an event like that. And if you have a more fatigue resistant engine about you by doing some anaerobic effort, the first part of those gravel races won't hurt as bad. You'll be able to perform better. So how do we do that? What's a good example? Well, I really just encourage you 1 day a week to do this. Go back to our Tuesday, Thursday sort of rhythm or modality. Tuesday, do 6 by 20 seconds of anaerobic capacity intervals, or what we call power intervals, with about 5-minute recovery in between. Go a little bit longer if you need it. And you want to incorporate that into a 60-minute session. Okay, so warm up and start in on these 6 by 20 seconds. And these are 10. A 10 out of 10, maybe, let's say 9 to 10 if you're like a little scared or hesitant or never done these before. Go really hard. I wouldn't even worry about the power. I'd focus on the effort. Do a 10 out of 10. Then you've got 5 minutes or more to recover if you need, and that recovery should be zone 1, and then just kind of like build back up into zone 2. Okay, 6 by 20 seconds, and then finish your session out with zone 2 endurance. Okay. So that's your Tuesday session. That Thursday session, if we're incorporating some of the zone 3, you can do that. I don't think you need another session like this during a base period. There's sometimes, if I have an athlete where this is a limiter or their recovery period is very good, sure, I could do 2 sessions per week of this. But if you're incorporating some zone 3 in addition to some volume, 1 session of this anaerobic capacity development is very fine. So Tuesday, anaerobic capacity. Wednesday, zone 2. Thursday, you can do zone 3 or zone 2, and onward with a long ride on the weekend. Monday, Friday, take rest days. Now, the third little hack, third little component here is incorporating a training camp in. All right. So sneaky coach always weaves in a long ride, right? Always sells that long ride capacity building. But training camps, what they are, they're a concentrated dose of high volume, mixed intensity training with a focus on volume and recovery. For a time-crunched cyclist, this can be a period of 3 to 5 days, usually 3 days, like a long weekend, where you get away from home or you can have a staycation, but basically you're putting work, life, family to the side. So you can just do a concentrated dose of riding, do more than you normally do. What's more? Well, like I said, whatever you normally do, just do more. Typically 3 to 6 hours per session. That's a good kind of duration of a ride for a camp. Okay. And then lots of recovery afterwards. Think of like, just, laying on the couch, being lazy, watching the TV, this kind of thing. The more you train, the more you do, the more recovery you'll need. Okay. But you'll find that if you can plan blocks like this, training camps, once a year, twice a year, maybe 3 times a year, but if you can incorporate those in, especially 4 to 6 weeks out from a main event of the season, you'll have a bigger aerobic engine or bigger capacity to handle that event or to handle more training for what is to come. So again, incorporate training camps in for 2023. I'll have some more episodes about how to do that, why it's important, but it is a very, very good way for a time-crunched athlete to do their base training and increase fitness early in the season. Okay. So in summary, think of base training as anything that really contributes to your fitness and performance for goal events. It's non-specific, generally aerobic training, but it can have some strength and anaerobic components to it, like I mentioned in detail above. And especially if the later elements, like the anaerobic capacity, if they're limiters or if they're not the main thing that's needed for the goal events. When you're starting the year, you want to establish good habits by simply riding zone 2 endurance each day, building CTL up to where it does plateau. At that point, then you start to incorporate intensity. Start incorporating in that zone or that tempo, zone 3 or high aerobic intervals, along with cadence work, some fast pedals, muscle tensions, all that kind of stuff you can find on TrainRight.com. And you can work on leg speed, muscular endurance, and you can incorporate and kind of make those training sessions go by a little bit more quickly with still some very focused work. Finally, you want to incorporate in a training camp on key weekends when you have less of life going on and you can put the bike more to the front burner. You'll find that if you just spend some weekends riding more, that will give you a nice boost of fitness for later on in the year, whether that's just more training or it's a big event that you've got on the docket that you're training for. So, just to make it very, very simple, everybody needs to do base training. And I think when you view base training as anything that is generally building you to be a better athlete, that's a good way to think about it. And don't also overthink how to do it. It is simply aerobic training. When you're time crunched, use some sub-threshold intensity to get you there. Ride long when you can, get your recovery, and carry on in your journey. That's all for today. I hope that the concentrated version of some of these tips and tricks help from CTS to you. In the upcoming episodes, I'll have some fellow CTS coaches coming on to talk about more about training camps, more about nutrition, and just answering your questions that we get trickled into us from various forms. So again, thanks for listening to the Time-Crunched Cyclist Podcast, and looking forward to sharing more information with you next week.